Well, good morning, everybody. Yeah, here to talk about flooding, and we had the vast majority of it, I think, at least the damage in the Northwest District. I'm going to talk about kind of setting the stage, what happened, what caused it, go into the flood, how we responded, ongoing recovery, some of the transportation impacts, and then maybe what's in store for later this year. And the news is not good. So that is the basin. That's what feeds in the Missouri River. The purple area is dammed on reservoir system. This area in Nebraska is not. So there's nothing to control that water when it hits. And you can see it's essentially all west. I mean, it goes all the way into Montana and Wyoming. So we get, mountain snowpack affects us, as well as the plain snowpack. All that is a picture of all the dams on that upper basin. But they all feed into Gavin's Point pretty much, so we really watch what's going on at Gavin's Point, because once it gets through the dam there, it's full on for us. And really, this all started back in February last year. I don't know if you remember the polar vortex that went through Nebraska. It was big news nationally. Temperatures dropped. Everything just froze solid, really thick, really deep. And that's the bomb cyclone that you heard about that hit Nebraska. You really can't see, but it covers half of the United States. And Nebraska was kind of in the bullseye. They had a blizzard, bad blizzard out west, rain in the east. Remember, that's the area I said isn't covered by dams. And then you top it all off with this rainfall rankings. You can see the North Dakota had the record wettest in 19 that they've ever seen. You can see everything else is much above average, except for Iowa. But remember, Iowa really doesn't affect us that much. And here's the runoffs from. It's actually actuals through September. October's projected, but you can see in March. This is the average. This is what we got. So that's why March was the start of this whole mess we got into. And you can see it just kept going. It kept going all year. Everything was, I guess at best double, sometimes 3 times of the average. Like I talked about a little bit ago, we deal with the actual rainfall obviously runs in, but then we're dealing with the snowpack in the mountain and the plains. I think this was from October, but their projection was 2019 would be the highest runoff in 120 years. I think it ended up being second. So we were dealing with some pretty historic stuff. Sorry, not following my instructions. I got outside my box. So here's what happened. That is Nebraska. Had the bomb cyclone hit, rain, blizzard, then it warmed up, so all the snow from the blizzard went downstream. Those are gigantic chunks of ice on the bridge. Nebraska dealt with a massive amount of bridge damage, massive. There's the new bridge. There's where the old one ended up. And what was going on is remember I talked about the ice freezing so thick everywhere? Well, when that flood came, it broke it all up. And then it just started hammering those bridges. And just all that pressure, it was just literally just pushing bridges out. Did you guys see the video of that bridge floating downstream? It was all over Facebook. It was just incredible in that ice jam. It was just incredible the things that Nebraska had to deal with. But all this was coming our way. And there's a timeline. March 13th, the blizzard hit Nebraska. You know, by March 16th, we were in full flood. Came down that fast. And here's how it affected us. We had massive amounts of closures. These are just the major ones. We had stuff closed all over the place. And as a matter of fact, we still do. I-29 was closed for 75 days. You can see the Rouleau crossing was 224 days. Brownville, 217 days. And Brownville was the pretty big issue for the region because the nuclear plant sits on the west side. A lot of people go there to work. We had people actually moving both sides of the river, renting apartments, just because they had it, the detours were just so massive. It was awful. But even once you got downstream, Atchison, Waverly, Miami, we're still talking 50 days, 170 days of closure. There was one point in the Northwest District, the only river crossing we had open was 36. And 36 actually never closed at St. Joe, thank goodness, because that was the only outlet for people to go. And Kansas was seeing a gob of traffic on US 36 and then 75 going up into Nebraska. And here's some of the stuff that we're dealing with. Here's just a shoulder issue. And what happens is when the water gets over, it works at that shoulder, and then it starts churning. And that's how the roads get undermined. They actually get undermined from the downstream side. It actually works its way back, and that's how you lose the road typically. And this is the video, if you can play it from there. I'm not sure how to play it. This is Brownville, also US 136. You can see there, and then if you look down there, there's Whitecaps. That's another break down there. But this isn't the flood that you usually think about where the water just comes up, sits for a while and goes away. The river was actually finding a new path. It was blowing out the levees, fill up the basin, break another levee downstream, and next thing you know, you have a new river. That's what was happening to us. It wasn't just up and down. It was fast-moving water. In that area there, probably had another 4 feet of water on it at its peak. And so that's what really caused all the damage. That's really not doing any damage. The damage is already done at that point. That was I-29 in the north part of Missouri. We actually only had water over I-29 for about 4 or 5 days. But the biggest issue was the tanks, because tanks just floated in and set right on the interstate, and we didn't know what was in them. No idea where they came from, no idea who owned them. So we worked with DNR very closely, and we got those tanks out of there the proper way and got them disposed of the proper way. That's Route U in Atchison County. Kind of looks like a scene from World War II. It looks like carpet bombing. That's Atchison Route B. That road actually wasn't flooded, but it turned to gravel because of all the haul trucks. So that's another thing we're dealing with, is that the Corps of Engineers and the railroad pretty much tied up all the quarries. And they're just running thousands and thousands of loads across these roads that were never designed for a combine, let alone thousands of rock trucks. So we have roads literally turning to gravel up there. That's Route 111, just completely gone. You can see all the damage up there too, and then there's big old logs up there. That's 159, that's a little Tarkio. What happened there is the abutments in the middle were undermined, and the whole bridge just, many of you probably saw that picture. That was all over social media. And we actually were just able to get to work on that this month because the water stayed so high, we couldn't get in there to build our work pad. So we've had it under contract for quite a while. That's 159 Holt County. It looks like 111, obviously. But all these places are where the river is trying to find a new channel, is what's going on. That's 59 in Buchanan County going over to Atchison, which Rebecca's very familiar with. And you can just see the long stretches of these roads that are flooded. It's not just little spots, it's miles of road. Fortunately, on this route, we really didn't see any damage, but it was just the time, and that road carries a lot of traffic. And water goes downstream, right? So Carroll County, there's 65 and 10 interchange. That's Route 41 in Carroll County. At 65 in Carroll County, that's, yeah, a few miles of 65 was underwater for quite a while. So how do we handle all this? Our first line of defense is our maintenance folks. They know, they saw the water coming. They proactively closed a lot of routes ahead of time, so everybody could remain safe, so the public didn't just drive into water. So I can't say enough about our men and women at MoDOT who do this. They are there 24/7, and the public really doesn't even realize that we do all this, but we're there all the time. Initially, there was a lot of discussion on I-29 in the media by politicians, and for good reason, because when you close an interstate corridor, it's a big deal. It affects commerce. So why do we close I-29, particularly if we only had water over it for 5 days? Well, Iowa was a disaster on I-29. They had, you could not get across I-29 in Iowa. It was flat out closed because of damage. So in 2011, we had a similar situation, and what we did is we routed traffic up to 136, then up US 59 into Iowa. That's a pretty narrow road with not good shoulders. Iowa was not real keen on sending traffic that way either. Our folks at the time didn't like it. We talked to Highway Patrol and the local law enforcement, and they said, don't do that again. That's not good. That's not safe. And then we also talked with our partners up in Iowa about, what's the best way to route this traffic? So this is going to be a while. So here's what we did. If you're coming in on I-70 or up from the south, we use the ITS system to peel people off I-35, go up to I-80 and across. If they made it up I-29, we had a hard closure here in St. Joe, and we shot them up 71. There still was ways to get back, to wind back around if you wanted to go up 59, but we were able to get the majority of the traffic heading up 71 and 35. And I-29 was always open for local traffic. And actually you could get there around, if you're coming from the south, you could just zip up 229 for those of you who know St. Joe without any trouble. An ongoing recovery. It's going to be a few years before we get back from this. Although we received 95% of the damage in Northwest, here's all the counties that were declared disaster counties. We had a lot of counties across Missouri that were damaged last year. So really it's kind of a two-pronged approach. Our maintenance folks do what they can to get these roads open, but some of the damage the scope was just so massive that our folks are not equipped or funded for that. So if we could, our folks fixed the shoulders and we got the roads open. Other roads just had to stay closed until we had contractors in there. So far we've awarded about $15 million in contracts. Got about $19 million coming up. We're at around $2.5 million in operating costs. So we're looking at least $36 million in damage. The reason I say at least is because if you add in just a little bit of resiliency and then fix these roads that had the indirect damage, we're up at $67 million. And the state experienced about $71 million in damage. And the resiliency isn't what we've been asked to do either. I mean, because every one of those routes that was underwater, we've been asked to raise the road. And I'm like, well, if you got a couple $100 million, we can, work on that. So
who actually raised the roads?
You name it, everybody. I mean, I even had a Kansas state representative call me from the Atchison area. So he was great to talk to. And actually, he was going to talk to the Kansas governor, try to get some Kansas money for Missouri, which was interesting. But it's politicians, it's residents, it's you name it. So there's US 59 before and after. And when the water came up the second time, it washed a lot of what we did there out. So we had to fix that spot twice. And on 136 and 159, I showed you the picture of the shoulders. We had, this is where we've actually brought in rock and we're ready to start paving now. But we had miles and miles and miles of this, and the public couldn't understand, why is it taking you so long? Just go in and fix it. Well, you're literally rebuilding parts of the road from scratch. I mean, it's actually worse than scratch because sometimes you're filling holes. Like the hole I showed you at 159, that one spot took 20,000 tons of rock. One spot. And we had multiple big holes. The hole on 111 was bigger. I never did hear how much that took, but we're talking massive amount of work. I mean, it just takes time. So there's still a lot of unknowns. The matching funds are starting to be known because they're coming out of the Northwest construction budget. We're going to eat about $6 or $7 million in match this year. We're temporarily over-programming to cover what we believe will be our reimbursements from FEMA and FHWA. I know Rebecca's been working with Economic Development Administration. There may be an opportunity for some grants to help on some of these routes, so we're still working on that. FEMA, we have $4, $5, $6 million worth of, that Route B that looked like it was bombed. That's in the February letting, but FEMA hasn't even been up to look at the road yet. And so we're letting it with a contingency that says if FEMA doesn't come through, we're canceling the job. Trying to put a little pressure on FEMA maybe. And I know they're swamped too. They just don't have highways. They have other things to deal with. But we're trying to get them up to look at our damage so we can get some confirmation that they'll pay their 75%. Resiliency, still kind of an unknown. I'll talk a little bit more about resiliency in a minute. And then levee setbacks, that's huge. Like the levees at Brownville, the Corps may actually relocate those levees back away from the river, which is obviously going to cause us all kinds of trouble because the levee is going to be higher than the road. We're going to be the constriction point then. So we're going to be asked to build very, very long bridge, which we don't have funding for. So we expect the Corps to make a determination, hopefully within the next month, on what they're going to do with that levee. But I was dealing with that on Route 2, and they chose to fund all of it with 100% state funds. They just flat out were paying state funds for it. But they just passed a 10-cent gas tax too, right, a few years ago. Now, resiliency, this is how we address resiliency on the downstream side of these routes, if we're going to go that way. Essentially, all you do is you cut it back and you put in a bunch of rock, and that keeps that churning action from tearing out the dirt. You have to have rock big enough, obviously, but that seems to do the trick. So here's some of the impacts we saw. Just the I-29 closure. Based on the detour, it was $656,000 a day to the public. That's what it cost the public to go around in time and car expenses. So the total impact was about $49 million just on I-29. 136, when Iowa 2 was still closed, it made the detour a lot longer. You're $427,000 a day just on the 36 impacts. If Iowa 2 is open, it's a mere 137,000. So, you know, we're talking big impacts to the public. I mean, this is real money. Some of the numbers we got from the other modes, you know, what, $230 million total between rail, air, and ports. And, you know, we can't forget about the people's livelihoods that are impacted too. I mean, these farmers aren't going to be able to plant this year. They can't get flood insurance if the levees aren't fixed. I mean, it's horrible. They lost grain in their bins that wasn't insured. Yeah, just the devastation was crazy because farmers had their bins full, a lot of them. When the water got in there, it swelled the grain, and it just blew steel apart. It just, all that pressure just burst them. For those of you who are familiar with 136, there's a big elevator there called Gavilon, and the water came up into their beans, and it fermented. It caught the pile on fire. What, 6 or 8 weeks ago, the fire finally went out. It burned. There was smoke coming out of that grain pile for months and months and months. So what's going to happen later this year? The Corps is getting rid of water as fast as they can, trying to build capacity in those reservoirs. They plan to have all the flood stores as designated available when the spring runoff starts. But they also estimate 2020 is going to have the 9th highest Missouri River flows on record based on snowpack, what's going on now. And on top of that, the snowpack's going to be on very wet soil, so there's going to be no infiltration. It's all just going to head right downstream to us. And then we're in deep trouble because the 100% core levees are around the Brownville area, 136 and north. And so the Corps has done a good job of repairing those temporarily to the same elevation as the existing levees. But once you get south of Brownville, it's a crapshoot on what's been done. A lot of times nothing's been done. Sometimes some farmers have come in and tried to do something. So we could very likely be in the same situation next year with roads flooded. 136 should be okay if those temporary repairs hold. But south of there, it's not looking good.
What's the holdup with the Corps? They haven't given approval on any of the levies.
Well, good question. The 100% core levy means the Corps comes in and pays 100%. Once you get south of there, there's a mix of private levies, not on the Corps system, and then there's other levies that they're not 100% Corps, they're 80/20s. But some of these repairs the Corps is letting $15-20 million contracts all the time to repair holes. Well, that 20% match on $20 million for a farmer is $4 million. And so a lot of that's the holdup. Well,
I know some of the levee districts that are 80/20 that have the money, they can't get the green light from the Corps to move forward, so they're just fixing them out of their own pocket because they can't get approval. It's just too much red tape.
Yeah. And don't drive around the barricades. Our biggest struggle for maintenance once they got the barricades up was keeping them in place. You and those of you who work at MoDOT are shaking your heads. It's awful. It really is amazing nobody got killed with some of the open holes we had with people moving barricades around. It is shocking. It's shocking. So, what questions do you all have?